Shortly, so just settle into a seat, and I've got great pleasure this afternoon in introducing the Honourable Kelvin Thomson, Federal Member of the House of Representatives for Wills, not far away from here. We're really pleased to have Kelvin here to speak to us today. He's been the federal member for the seat of Wills since the 1980s, and his history from childhood is in that area, having grown up in Pascoe Vale. He served as Coburg councillor, then deputy mayor, and later was the ALP member for Pascoe Vale in the state government. In 1996, Kelvin was elected to the federal parliament and has served in a range of shadow ministries. Kelvin was re-elected to the seat of Wills in 2007. Of great interest to all of us here is Kelvin's interest in the environment and conservation and wildlife, because that usually motivates people who feel strongly about human population growth. Kelvin has articulated the obvious link between environmental stress and the impact of people, especially in rising numbers. And he recently released a very detailed and coherent, doable plan to stabilise Australia's population. We look forward to hearing his interpretation of the politics of this issue. Would you please welcome Kelvin Thomson?
Thanks very much, Jill, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to Sustainable Population Australia this afternoon. I've been greatly encouraged by the avalanche of supportive emails, letters and phone calls that I and my office have received since I first spoke on the issue of population in the Parliament back in August. The response I've received, over 95% support, reaffirms the opinion poll evidence that 60% of Australians believe that a population of 35 million by 2049, which is the most recent official Treasury projection, is too many. We have a lot of supporters out there. What I want to talk about this afternoon is how do we win this? How do we meet the political challenges and translate that support into real policy change and a better future for our children, Australia and the world? The first political challenge is to understand the problem. We have to understand where the push for higher population comes from. While some of it comes from migrant representatives, and some of it comes from particular religious leaders who adhere to highly literal interpretations of religious texts written when the world's population was 1/25 of what it is now, most of it comes from sections of business. Business enjoys close and regular access to political parties and political leaders, courtesy of endless fundraising breakfasts, fundraising lunches and fundraising dinners, of which I have attended quite a few. During my political lifetime, money has assumed a progressively larger role. Mass political parties used to have plenty of volunteers to letterbox their material and campaign. Increasingly, the volunteers have disappeared, and political parties look to paid distribution services such as Australia Post or the private distributors to distribute their material. This, of course, costs money. So too does alternative means of campaigning, such as TV, radio and newspaper ads. And it's also the case that political parties are wary about getting offside with business. And regrettably, some business entities, and property developers in particular, are in the ears of politicians day in, day out, seeking high population. They regard population growth as the yellow brick road to easy profit. For them it has two functions: creating a pool of surplus labour to put downward pressure on wages and salaries, and even more importantly, building a bigger market share to generate more sales. This seems easier than competing with rival businesses. One other group we need to be aware of who are fond of population growth is Treasury and other government bureaucrats, because population growth means a bigger GDP. It doesn't mean we're better off. If a country's wealth increases by 25% while its population increases by 60%, on average each resident is actually poorer. But the media always report GDP rather than GDP per person, and it always sounds good to be able to say the economy is growing and hope that nobody looks at the fine print. Upton Sinclair put it succinctly: it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. So that is what we are up against. I don't think anyone in this room underestimates them, and we certainly shouldn't. They have won every single battle so far. Australia's runaway population and the world's bears that out. The second political challenge is to expose the arguments in favour of rising population for the myths they are. Let me deal with 7 of them. First, that we need a bigger population to drive economic growth and prosperity. The bigger is better myth. If this were true, the wealthiest per person nations in the world would be those with the biggest populations. They're not. In fact, 8 of the top 10 nations in the world of wealth in terms of per person GDP have populations of less than 10 million. Sweden, for example, is entrenched in the world's top 10 with a growing economy but a population which has been stable for many years. On the other hand, Argentina started the 20th century far wealthier than Australia, but having doubled our population growth, Argentina today has per person GDP worth only 40% of Australia's. I hear some population boosters lamenting that Europe's population has stopped growing and saying we don't want to follow that example, calling it stagnation and so on. Europe's population is indeed now about the same as it was in 1950. But of those 10 wealthiest per person countries, 8 are in Europe. Do the population boosters seriously prefer what has happened in Africa? Since 1950, Africa's population has more than quadrupled, growing from 221 million then to 973 million last year. 25 years ago, Ethiopia had a population of around 34 million. Now its population is 72 million. According to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organisation, the number of chronically hungry people in the world, people suffering from perpetual and severe hunger, has risen to 1 billion. In addition, as many as 2 billion more people live in perpetual food insecurity, missing meals and often not knowing where their next meal will come from. No prizes for guessing where this increased misery is happening. It isn't Europe. World population growth is precisely the reason why world food prices have risen and why more people, not less, are starving and suffering from waterborne diseases. And for Australia, runaway population means our mineral and resource wealth is spread more thinly, and there is greater competition for our available food, water, petrol and land, pushing up food prices, pushing up the price of housing, pushing up the price of water, pushing up the price of petrol. We are not, repeat, not better off as a consequence of this. The second myth is that a bigger population will tackle population and workforce ageing, and that population and workforce ageing is a terrible problem. Let me observe that the 14-point population reform plan that I've proposed would not lead to an ageing population or workforce. But we should not fall for this idea that social ageing is a disaster and older people are a burden. Ageing is a sign of success, both individually and as a society. The oldest societies are the healthiest and wealthiest. The youngest societies are those with the lowest life expectancy. We're not just ageing, we're ageing healthier and are capable of working on for longer than we used to. And there's abundant scope to bring people into the workforce who are presently not in it. Many young people are out of it. Many aged between 45 and 65 are out of it. Many Indigenous Australians are out of it. Bringing them in would be good for them and good for the country. And if you really think workforce ageing is a disaster, let me quote from the Department of Treasury Economic Roundup of December 2000, which said, "In response to the slowdown in the growth of the working age population, business may introduce incentives to retain existing workers, encourage them to increase the number of hours they work or defer their retirement, and to attract additional workers into the labour force. These incentives could take the form of higher real wages or other non-pecuniary benefits such as the opportunity to work from home, part-time hours for those full-time workers considering retirement, or more generous maternity leave arrangements." So there you have it, folks. This is the catastrophe that awaits us if we don't act to increase the population. Higher real wages, working from home, part-time options, more generous maternity leave arrangements. What a disaster.